They never say it directly. Not because they cannot, but because if men truly understood this one thing, entire relationships would change overnight. A man can spend years chasing approval, sacrificing his peace, reshaping his personality, suppressing his instincts, believing this is what makes him lovable. And yet, the harder he tries, the more invisible he becomes. Strange, isn't it? Most men are taught that devotion creates attraction, that constant attention creates emotional security, that explaining themselves, proving themselves, and endlessly giving pieces of their soul will somehow make someone stay. But the truth hides in silence. And silence is where power lives. The Stoics understood something centuries ago that modern men are only beginning to realize now. People do not value what is easily controlled. Human nature gravitates toward strength, certainty, and emotional stability. Not noise. Not desperation. Not endless validation. And this truth terrifies many people because it forces them to confront something uncomfortable. Neediness does not create love. It destroys it. Imagine a man named Elias. Quiet. Intelligent. Loyal beyond reason. The kind of man society praises. The man who texts back instantly. The man who apologizes even when he is not wrong. The man who bends himself into impossible shapes just to avoid conflict. He believed this made him good. And maybe it did. But goodness without self-respect becomes weakness in the eyes of the world. Elias met a woman he thought would change his life forever. At first, everything felt effortless. Long conversations after midnight. Shared secrets. Endless laughter. She told him she had never met someone so emotionally mature. Those words became his addiction. Slowly, without realizing it, he built his identity around keeping her happy. If she became distant, he panicked. If her tone changed, he overanalyzed. If she pulled away, he chased harder. Every day, he abandoned himself a little more. And this is where most men lose without understanding why. Because the moment a man becomes emotionally dependent on someone else's approval, he silently hands over his power. His emotional center no longer belongs to him. It belongs to whoever can give or withdraw attention. The Stoics warned about this long ago. Epictetus once said that any person capable of disturbing your peace becomes your master. Think about that carefully. The modern world teaches men to obsess over being desired. But Stoicism teaches something far more dangerous. A man who cannot stand alone cannot truly be free. And freedom is what creates presence. Not arrogance. Not cruelty. Not manipulation. Presence. The ability to remain grounded while emotions storm around you. Elias did not understand this. So he kept giving more. Longer messages. More reassurance. More emotional availability. He believed love required constant proof. But something strange began happening. The more available he became, the less valued he felt. Conversations lost depth. Her excitement faded. The energy shifted in ways he could not explain. So he did what most men do when they fear losing someone. He tried harder. And that was the beginning of his collapse. Because desperation has a scent. People feel it even when unspoken. It appears in the way a man waits for replies. In the way he abandons his priorities. In the way he tolerates disrespect just to avoid being alone. The tragedy is that many good men are never taught this. They are taught how to impress others, but never how to master themselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a strong mind is not shaken by external events because it understands that peace comes from within, not from the behavior of other people. But Elias had built his peace on unstable ground. One evening, after hours of waiting for a response, he stared at his phone in complete silence. His chest felt heavy. His thoughts raced in circles. He wondered what he had done wrong. And then it happened. A realization so painful it changed him forever. He no longer recognized himself. Every decision he made revolved around someone else's emotions. Every ounce of confidence he once possessed had slowly dissolved into anxiety disguised as love. That night, for the first time in years, he sat alone without distractions. No music. No messages. No noise. Just silence. And in that silence, he confronted a truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The fear of losing others often begins with the abandonment of yourself. He realized he had become a performer in his own life, carefully editing his words, suppressing his boundaries, pretending to be endlessly agreeable because he feared rejection more than dishonor. But the Stoics believed that a man who sacrifices his principles to gain affection loses both. And suddenly, memories began replaying in his mind. Every moment he ignored disrespect. Every time he apologized for having standards. Every occasion he accepted emotional confusion instead of clarity. Not because he was weak by nature, but because he had been conditioned to believe love required self-erasure. Modern culture rarely tells men the truth. People are drawn toward those who possess inner fullness. Those who do not beg for attention. Those who can walk away from what disturbs their peace. Because emotional independence creates gravity. And gravity cannot be faked. Elias started changing in ways nobody expected. He stopped over-explaining. Stopped chasing. Stopped negotiating for basic respect. But something even deeper changed inside him. For the first time, he began observing his emotions instead of obeying them. When anxiety appeared, he did not run from it. When loneliness surfaced, he did not immediately seek distraction. When rejection threatened his ego, he remained still long enough to understand it. That stillness became his rebirth. Because Stoicism is not about becoming emotionless. It is about refusing to become enslaved by emotion. And most people never reach this level of awareness because they are addicted to external validation. They need constant reassurance to feel worthy. Constant attention to feel important. But a man who learns to validate himself becomes extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. That is the hidden shift nobody talks about. When a man no longer fears being alone, his entire energy changes. His words become calmer. His reactions slower. His presence heavier. He stops trying to convince people of his value because he no longer questions it internally. And strangely enough, this is often the exact moment others begin noticing him again. Not because he became colder, but because he stopped abandoning himself for acceptance. Elias finally understood why he had suffered for so long. He thought love meant attachment. But attachment rooted in fear always becomes control, anxiety, and emotional dependency. Real strength was something entirely different. It was the ability to care deeply without losing yourself completely. And once a man understands this truth, he begins to see the world differently. He notices how many people confuse intensity with connection. How many relationships are built on insecurity instead of respect. How many individuals secretly seek emotional control while calling it love. That realization changed the way he moved through life. He became quieter. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because once a man experiences the peace that comes from self-mastery, chaos no longer feels attractive to him anymore. And this is the secret hidden beneath everything modern society tells men. The most powerful man in the room is rarely the loudest, richest, or most admired. It is the man who remains emotionally unshaken when the world tests him. The man who does not crumble when attention disappears. The man who does not betray his values to avoid loneliness. The man who understands that his worth was never meant to be negotiated in the first place. And the terrifying part is, once a man reaches this level of awareness, he can never fully return to who he was before. Because he starts seeing through every illusion that once controlled him. He begins to notice how people test boundaries without words. How respect is often measured in silence rather than speeches. How the world quietly observes what a man tolerates before deciding how to treat him. And for the first time, Elias understood why so many men remain trapped in endless cycles of emotional exhaustion. They mistake attachment for purpose. They build their identity around being needed, desired, or chosen by someone else. And the moment that attention weakens, their entire sense of self begins collapsing like a house built on sand. But Stoicism demanded something harsher. It demanded that a man become complete before seeking completion in others. Most people never do this. They rush into relationships carrying unresolved fears, hidden insecurities, and silent emptiness. Then they expect another human being to heal wounds they never had the courage to confront alone. And when that fails, they call it heartbreak. But often, it is dependency revealing itself. Elias started seeing this pattern everywhere. Men destroying their ambitions to maintain unstable relationships. Men tolerating disrespect because they feared starting over. Men losing years trying to earn affection from people who were emotionally unavailable from the beginning. And beneath all of it was the same invisible fear. I am nothing if I am alone. That fear controls millions of lives. It turns intelligent men into approval seekers. It turns confident men into anxious overthinkers. It turns calm men into emotional prisoners. The Stoics believed that the root of suffering is attachment to what lies outside your control. Not because relationships are meaningless, but because placing your inner peace into another person's hands guarantees instability. Human emotions change. People change. Desires change. But principles remain. And a man anchored in principles becomes difficult to break. Elias remembered a moment that once haunted him. Months earlier, during an argument, he had begged someone to understand his intentions. He explained himself for nearly an hour, desperately trying to avoid losing the connection. At the time, he thought he was fighting for love. Now he realized something devastating. He had been bargaining for approval. There is a difference. One comes from strength. The other comes from fear. And fear always leaks through. People sense when a man is terrified of losing them. It changes the entire dynamic. Suddenly, he becomes reactive instead of centered. He sacrifices honesty for harmony. He hides his standards to maintain temporary peace. But temporary peace purchased through self-betrayal eventually becomes inner resentment. That resentment slowly poisons the soul. This is why many men wake up years later feeling empty inside relationships they fought desperately to keep. Not because they were unloved, but because they abandoned themselves so completely that nothing authentic remained. Elias refused to continue living that way. So he started rebuilding his life piece by piece. He returned to discipline, to solitude, to silence. He began waking before sunrise just to sit alone with his thoughts. At first, the silence felt unbearable. Without constant distractions, every insecurity rose to the surface. Regret, loneliness, fear. But instead of escaping them, he observed them. That was the difference. Most people spend their entire lives running from discomfort. The Stoics walked directly into it. Because hidden beneath discomfort is truth. And truth transforms men. Weeks passed. Then months. Something inside Elias became steadier. He no longer checked his phone obsessively. No longer measured his worth through responses, attention, or validation. He started focusing on things that existed independently of anyone's approval. His body, his mind, his work, his purpose. And slowly, an unfamiliar feeling emerged. Peace. Not excitement. Not temporary pleasure. Peace. The kind that cannot be taken away by rejection or silence. That inner stability changed the way others responded to him. People listened more carefully when he spoke. Conversations felt different. Even his presence carried a weight that had not existed before. Because desperation had disappeared. And without desperation, a man becomes unpredictable in the most powerful way possible. He no longer acts from fear. Most people are unconsciously controlled by fear of abandonment. That fear shapes their personalities, their decisions, even the way they love. It causes them to tolerate what they should walk away from. To remain loyal to situations destroying them internally. To confuse emotional chaos with passion. But once fear loses control over a man, his standards rise naturally. Not out of ego. Out of self-respect. And self-respect changes everything. Elias learned that boundaries are not walls designed to punish others. They are reflections of what a man refuses to destroy within himself. Weak men believe boundaries push people away. Strong men understand boundaries reveal who truly respects them. That realization altered every relationship in his life. Some people became uncomfortable with his calmness. Others disappeared entirely once they realized emotional manipulation no longer worked on him. And strangely enough, he did not chase them. Because he finally understood something the Stoics tried to teach centuries ago. Anything that costs a man his inner peace is already too expensive. One evening, while walking alone through the city streets, Elias watched people rushing past each other beneath the cold lights of the night. Everyone seemed desperate for something. Attention. Love. Recognition. Escape. The entire world looked restless. And suddenly he saw himself in them. The old version of himself. The man who constantly searched outside himself for permission to feel valuable. He almost smiled at the memory. Because now he understood why emotionally grounded people appear so rare. Most individuals are never taught how to sit peacefully with themselves. Silence terrifies them. Solitude exposes them. Stillness forces confrontation with everything they spent years avoiding. So they drown themselves in noise. Relationships. Social media. Validation. Endless distractions. Anything to avoid meeting themselves honestly. But a man who survives solitude gains something dangerous. Clarity. And clarity destroys illusions. Elias began noticing how often attraction had little to do with appearances and everything to do with emotional energy. The people who commanded attention were rarely the ones trying hardest to impress others. They simply carried certainty within themselves. A certainty untouched by praise or rejection. That kind of presence cannot be manufactured through tactics or manipulation. It emerges naturally when a man stops needing constant external approval to feel complete. And perhaps that is the truth many people secretly fear men discovering. Because a man who governs himself becomes impossible to control emotionally. He no longer reacts impulsively to withdrawal. No longer collapses when ignored. No longer sacrifices his values for temporary affection. He becomes selective, calm, patient. And patience is power in a world addicted to instant emotional reactions. Months later, someone from his past reached out unexpectedly. The old Elias would have responded immediately, heart racing with hope and anxiety. He would have analyzed every word, searching for hidden meaning. But now, he simply stared at the message without emotional urgency. Not because he stopped caring. Because he stopped needing. That distinction changed everything. For the first time in his life, he realized love feels entirely different when fear is removed from it. It becomes lighter, cleaner, more honest. Without fear, there is no obsession. Without insecurity, there is no desperate control. Only choice. And choice is where real freedom begins. But freedom comes with a price few people are willing to pay. Because once a man becomes emotionally free, he can no longer tolerate relationships built on games, confusion, or manipulation. His standards rise beyond appearances, beyond words, beyond temporary chemistry. He begins searching for peace instead of intensity. And that changes the entire direction of his life. What Elias did not yet realize was that this transformation was only the beginning. Because the moment a man truly reclaims control over himself, the world starts testing whether his strength is real or merely another illusion waiting to collapse. And the test did come. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way life always challenges a changed man. It began with small provocations. A message left unseen. A conversation that felt slightly colder than before. A familiar pattern trying to re-enter his life as if nothing had changed. Elias noticed something interesting. The world does not react well when a man stops reacting the way he used to. Because people are accustomed to predictable emotional responses. They learn your patterns. They push certain buttons and expect the same outcome every time. And when that cycle breaks, it creates discomfort in others. Not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer controllable. The message from his past returned again, this time more personal. Less casual. More intentional. As if testing whether the old version of him still existed underneath the surface. There was warmth in the words. And something carefully placed to trigger memory. The old Elias would have taken the bait without hesitation. He would have read between lines that were never meant to be analyzed. He would have reopened doors that had once cost him his peace. But now he simply sat with it. No rush. No anxiety. No emotional collapse. Just awareness. And awareness is where freedom becomes irreversible. He realized something crucial in that moment. The real battle was never between him and other people. It was between his old impulses and his new awareness. Because the past does not leave quietly. It returns wearing familiar faces, familiar emotions, familiar illusions, trying to convince you that comfort is worth losing yourself again. Elias felt it for a second. That pull. That temptation to step back into the version of himself that was easier to understand but harder to respect. But Stoicism had changed the language of his mind. Now he asked a different question. Will this bring me closer to peace or further away from it? And suddenly, the answer became obvious. Not emotional. Not complicated. Just clear. He did not respond immediately. Not out of games. Not out of strategy. But because he no longer lived inside urgency. Time no longer controlled his emotions. And that alone changed everything. Days passed. Silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. The same person reached out again, but this time differently. Less confident. More uncertain. As if sensing that the emotional leverage they once had no longer worked. Elias observed this shift without pride or ego. Because Stoicism does not teach superiority over others. It teaches mastery over the self. And in that mastery, there is no need to prove anything. He realized how much of human interaction is built on invisible emotional exchange. Attention creates attachment. He realized how much of human interaction is built on invisible emotional exchange. Attention creates attachment. Withdrawal creates anxiety. Mixed signals create obsession. But when a man removes himself from that emotional economy, the system loses its power over him. He becomes unreadable. Not because he is hiding, but because he is no longer overreacting. When attention disappears. When validation fades. When silence becomes your only companion. That is where a man is either rebuilt or revealed. Elias was no longer afraid of being alone. And that single shift changed his entire reality. Because once loneliness stops being a threat, manipulation loses its foundation. You no longer stay where you are not valued. You no longer explain yourself endlessly. You no longer beg for clarity from people committed to confusion. You simply observe and choose. But with this new clarity came something heavier. Responsibility. Because awareness always demands discipline. A man who sees clearly can no longer pretend he does not. He cannot return to ignorance. He cannot unsee patterns. He cannot ignore disrespect once he recognizes it for what it is. And this is where most transformations are tested. Not in realization, but in consistency. Elias understood that every day would now be a quiet decision. To either return to old emotional habits, or to remain aligned with the peace he had built slowly, painfully, deliberately. There was no final victory. No permanent arrival. Only maintenance. Only discipline. Only awareness repeated until it becomes identity. And as he continued walking, he felt something unfamiliar settle within him. Not excitement. Not emotional highs. But something far more stable. A quiet certainty that no matter what returned from his past, he would no longer abandon himself to meet it. And yet, life does not stop testing certainty. Because certainty is only real when it survives pressure. A few weeks later, Elias found himself in a situation he thought he had already outgrown. It was not the person that changed everything. It was the feeling. That quiet reappearance of familiarity. A memory disguised as opportunity. A moment that looked harmless on the surface but carried the weight of everything he had already lived through. A meeting was suggested. Simple. Casual. No expectations, or at least that is what the words claimed. But Elias had learned something important by now. Words are rarely the truth. Patterns are, and patterns never lie. He sat with the invitation longer than before. Not because he was confused, but because he was observant. He was no longer the man who reacted instantly to emotional triggers. He had learned to sit in the space between impulse and action. That space was where control lived. And in that silence, memories returned. Not the romanticized ones. The real ones. The anxiety behind late replies. The self-doubt disguised as patience. The quiet erosion of self-respect that once felt like love. He remembered how easily he used to abandon his own center just to maintain temporary connection. And for a moment, he saw how close the past still was. Not outside him. Inside him. Because Stoicism does not remove old versions of you. It exposes how often they still try to return. Elias realized something uncomfortable. Growth is not about becoming someone entirely new. It is about recognizing the old self without becoming it again. The invitation remained on the screen. No urgency. No pressure. Just a choice. And choices reveal identity more than circumstances ever do. He thought about the version of himself who would have said yes immediately. The version who confused access with affection. The version who believed presence meant progress. The version who thought effort alone could secure emotional stability. That man was not evil. He was simply unguarded. And being unguarded in an emotional world is a silent form of suffering. Elias leaned back. For the first time, he did not ask, "What will they think if I refuse?" He asked something far more powerful. "What does this do to my inner state if I accept?" And the answer came without noise. Not peace. Not alignment. Not clarity. Only disturbance disguised as hope. That was enough. He closed the message. No announcement. No explanation. No emotional justification. Just a quiet decision made without drama. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible happened inside him. The need to be understood disappeared. Because he finally understood himself. Days passed again. Life continued its quiet rhythm. But something had shifted permanently. He no longer felt the urge to revisit emotional histories that once defined him. He stopped revisiting conversations in his mind. He stopped rehearsing alternate endings to past situations. He stopped searching for meaning in places that had already shown him their nature. Instead, he started noticing something else. How much energy he used to waste on emotional forecasting, predicting reactions, preparing responses, managing perceptions. A constant internal performance designed to avoid discomfort. Now, that energy had nowhere to go. So it returned to him. And for the first time, he experienced something rare. Mental silence without emptiness. Presence without tension. Awareness without fear. And in that state, he understood a deeper Stoic truth. Freedom is not the absence of people. It is the absence of dependence on how people behave. That realization did not make him cold. It made him clear. He still felt. Still observed. Still connected. But nothing owned his internal stability anymore. Not approval. Not rejection. Not memory. Only principle. Only awareness. Only choice. And as he continued walking through life, something in him softened in a different way. Not toward others, but toward himself. He no longer judged the man he used to be. He no longer labeled his past mistakes as weakness. He saw them as stages of awareness he had to pass through to understand what peace actually costs. Because peace is never given. It is built. Moment by moment. Decision by decision. Until one day, you realize you are no longer the man who needs emotional chaos to feel alive. You are the man who can sit in silence and still feel whole. And for Elias, that was no longer a philosophy. It was his way of being. And yet, even wholeness does not mean the absence of temptation. It only means the ability to see it clearly without being controlled by it. One evening, as Elias sat alone, he noticed something unexpected. A feeling he had not experienced in a long time. Not anxiety. Not longing, but curiosity. The kind that does not come from need, but from memory. He wondered why the past sometimes returns even when it has no place in the present. And then he understood. The past does not return to teach you something new. It returns to see if you are still the same person who once failed to resist it. That realization made him pause. Because growth is not proven in isolation. It is proven in repetition. In the same emotional patterns appearing again, and your response no longer being the same. A notification appeared again. Different tone this time. Softer. More reflective. Less certain. Almost as if the distance had created its own kind of clarity on the other side as well. Elias did not rush to interpret it. He had stopped treating every message as a puzzle about his worth. Instead, he observed it like a passing event. No story attached. No hidden meaning assumed. Just information. And information alone carries no emotional power unless you give it one. Still, something inside him noticed the shift. Not in the message, but in himself. There was no pull. No internal urgency to respond. No desire to fix, explain, or re-enter emotional uncertainty. That silence inside him was new. And unfamiliar peace often feels like emptiness to the mind that once survived on chaos. He stood up and walked toward the window. The city lights stretched far into the distance, each one representing lives moving with invisible struggles, desires, attachments, and fears. And for a moment, he saw something clearly. Most people are not trapped by others. They are trapped by their reaction to others. Elias used to be one of them. Every shift in attention used to change his internal weather. Every emotional distance used to feel like loss. Every silence used to demand explanation. But now, silence had become neutral. Not threatening. Not rewarding. Just silence. And in that neutrality, he found something stronger than emotional intensity. Equilibrium. The Stoics believed that a man is rich in proportion to the number of things he can afford to let go of. And Elias finally understood what that meant in practice. Not as theory, but as lived experience. He could let go of explanations. He could let go of being understood. He could let go of closure that depended on others. And still remain intact. That was the real transformation. Not becoming indifferent, but becoming unbreakable in how little he needed from the world to remain stable within himself. Days passed again, but something different started happening internally. He noticed how his decisions became simpler. Less emotional negotiation. Less internal conflict. Less need for external validation before acting. Life became less about reaction and more about direction. And direction, once established, removes chaos naturally. But with that clarity came a quiet realization. There is no final version of discipline. There is only practice. Every day presents a subtle return of old habits, old thoughts, old impulses, old emotional shortcuts. And every day demands the same response. To observe without attachment. To choose without fear. To act without emotional distortion. Elias understood now why so few people truly change. Because change is not a moment. It is maintenance against everything within you that wants to return to what is familiar. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar peace. And that is where most people unknowingly surrender. But he no longer did. Even when memory whispered. Even when curiosity returned. Even when silence felt too honest. He stayed with himself. Not as resistance, but as alignment. And somewhere deep inside that steady presence, he realized something profound. He was no longer trying to become someone new. He was simply no longer abandoning who he already was.